The season of Lent is not simply just a time where we try to suffer a little bit to make God happy. This is about setting our eyes firmly on Easter Sunday, on the gift of the resurrection, and to realize that this is a time for us to prepare, to leave behind the things that are holding us back from the resurrection, the things that are stealing our joy. And I think this is a really important question to wrestle with, because we live in an age which is amazing. We are surrounded by technology. We've got more options than any other generation in human history ever had. We can, in a sense, be blinded by the thought that this is paradise. And perhaps maybe the greatest temptation for the Christian is to think that our secular society has actually worked out the solutions, and all we have to do is just put a thin Christian veneer over the top to kind of assure ourselves of salvation. And yet maybe this is a time when we need to look deeper and say, well, is this actually fulfilling the promise? Is this actually what God desired of us? For all of our great human achievement, have we actually found the promised land? You see, if you go back to the original story in Genesis, God designed a world which we would be filled with love. Everywhere we looked, we would see God, we would see his love, we would live in complete, perfect harmony. As soon as that voice of the tempter came in, the temptation was to try and build paradise without God, to become gods without God's help. And maybe that's the sort of world we've created, a world which is built on pride and strength and power. And that's wonderful if you're wealthy and successful and educated. And yet sometimes we can blind ourselves to the fact that there's a lot of people being stepped on in the process. And there's a lot of things which our heart truly desires, which are actually being stolen from us. If we go back to that story at the beginning of the book of Exodus, where the Israelites are enslaved and they're being worked so hard that they simply can't remember who they were as a people. They no longer have a memory of who God is. And every spare moment they get, they're just simply trying to de-stress, trying to get as much comfort as they can to get back to work the next day. We don't really know why they were in slavery. The book of Exodus doesn't explain. All it says is that the Pharaoh was working them so hard they had no time to spare. Back in that day, the most common form of slavery was actually a slavery of debt. For whatever reason, if a person owed a huge amount of money, they just had to work until that debt was paid. And often they would get caught in this endless cycle because as they worked, they needed food, they ended up more in debt. They needed accommodation, they ended up more in debt. And I often think there's something of that in our modern world. As though despite all our freedom, we're actually in this almost economic slavery. We're caught in a lifestyle which is saying you need to live paradise. You need to live the fullness of joy and the fullness of opportunity. And yet to finance that, you have to work yourself to the bone. You have to work yourself so hard that you no longer have time for your marriage. You no longer have time for your children. And you definitely don't have time for prayer. In the book of Exodus, when Moses first goes to Pharaoh, he doesn't mention anything about going to the promised land. He simply says, let my people go into the desert for 3 days so that they can offer sacrifice and worship. And it was almost like maybe Moses didn't know the plan that God had, but he knew that if the people could come back to prayer, they would remember who God was and they'd remember who they were. And that revelation alone would change everything. It would change the way they saw themselves, the way they saw their relationship to society, to politics, to economics, and they would suddenly have a desire for something bigger. I think this time of Lent is a time when God is calling us once again to go for 3 days into the desert, or hopefully 40 days into the desert, and offer sacrifice and worship. And remember who God is and remember who you are. And in the light of that truth, to reassess everything, to look back at our world with fresh eyes, to understand what is this world you're caught up in, the frantic busyness, the endless work, the need to pay for a lifestyle that's maybe unsustainable, and what is being sacrificed for the pursuit of that. In what way are we actually losing our joy? In what way are we losing the most precious things of our life? This time of Lent is meant to not just be giving up a little thing to make a small little act of sacrifice to God. I think it's meant to be like a complete stocktake of our life, to sit back and look again at what is this world we're caught up in. Step off the endless treadmill for a few moments and look again at what is the promise God gave you. And perhaps what do you need to leave behind so that you can actually take hold of that?